Hey, we're going to talk about beer all flavors and what they mean and what to look for and sometimes how to fix them on this episode of Running on Beer's Road to BJCP. Alright, so this is the third video. Videos after this will probably be more towards the actual styles, where we'll talk about what is in the style guidelines, which is pretty important to know for the entrance exam. Again, big disclaimer, this is not checked or endorsed by the BJCP. So if you think anything's wrong, feel free to say something in the comments. Hey, while you're at it, maybe click that subscribe button too. So mind you, everything from this is from some of the BJCP materials, which they have freely available on their website, and there's a link in the description to be able to see that and take a look at it for yourself. So I'm going in order, not the same order that they use on their materials or that they use on the score sheet, but they are all listed down here along the side of the score sheet. So these are important to know, but I'm going in the order of what I think is probably the most common, and some of these are really based on one or two judging experiences and just some other things I've had outside, out at restaurants, whatever. So it's not in the same order, but it's really kind of more likely order. The first one is oxidization. So you take a beer, sniff it, and it smells like wet cardboard. Or maybe wet dog. Usually wet cardboard, though. I get it as wet cardboard. And in all these cases, you might get it a little differently, but generally it'll focus around that. Also, sometimes you'll see that the beer is cloudy or darker. This beer is not oxidized. This is actually a lager. The glass got some condensation on it, but it's actually really clear. So it's not oxidized. But a lot of times you'll see like a cloudy appearance in the beer. Beers that should be pale, like a pale ale or a lager, might be a little bit more brown. New England style IPAs are really susceptible to oxidization, and those will turn brown. I mean, like really bad brown. In fact, Brewlosophy had a post on it. I think it was in one of their experiments where they left a New England IPA just out, and after I think it was after 2 days, it was straight brown. So disgusting. This is usually due to mishandling of the beer after fermentation. Usually before fermentation, you can over-oxidize a beer, but I think it's really difficult. But after fermentation, it is really important to not splash the beer. So somebody, maybe splashing the beer into a bottling bucket, particularly if they're new. In fact, I got a lot of oxidization out of, it was a table of American Blonde, American Pale Ale, American Amber, American Brown, and California Commons. So there was a lot of pale ales and a lot of amber ales that were oxidized, and it seemed like it was from newer brewers. So a lot of times this means that they somehow mishandled the fermented wort, or actually beer at that point. Also, underfilled bottles. If you don't use like a beer gun or something that you can purge the head space, you use like one of those, like what I used to do, a racking cane that's cut off and just stuck down into the bottle to fill from the bottom. You can underfill a bottle and get an oxidized flavor after about a week, and that's from experience, particularly in IPAs, like New England and milkshake IPAs particularly. So if you get this on a score sheet, the obvious thing is treat the beer well. Don't splash it. Don't let oxygen get to it a whole lot. And beer, a lot of styles are pretty forgiving. I mean, I've had a beer that splashed a little bit into a keg that was purged, and I couldn't taste any oxidization, and I was looking for it. There were a few times where I thought, man, is this oxidized? And it never tasted like it. So, if you try and do as much as you can, beers can be forgiving for minor mess-ups. Next one, acetaldehyde. That's like a green apple. Some people say latex paint or like a pumpkin, like a raw pumpkin kind of flavor. And that's generally due to the beer taking off the yeast too soon or not being allowed to age enough. It's generally a yeast characteristic. Actually, it's always a yeast characteristic. Now, some styles do allow this in low levels. There's a lot of the American lagers, American light lagers, will allow this in low levels. And what that means is if it gets in the way of you enjoying the beer, it's too high. If you can just taste it, it's fine in those styles. Not all styles. The next one is diacetyl. It's a butter flavor. Literally microwave butter. And by literally, I found a bag of microwave popcorn once, or I found the box to the bag of microwave popcorn, and looked on the ingredients on the side. One of the ingredients that was listed was diacetyl. That usually means your fermentation's not complete. So a lot of yeast, particularly some of the New England style yeasts like the London, the white yeast 1203, London 3 ale yeast, will produce diacetyl prominently sometimes during fermentation. But if the fermentation's allowed to finish, you clean up that, or the yeast cleans up that diacetyl, and you're fine. And I've even done this once. I brewed a New England IPA, and I think I dry hopped it like 2 or 3 days in the fermentation. Get some of that biotransformation going. And I tasted it then, knowing that the beer wasn't ready. I mean, I think it probably started at 1060, let's say, and it was probably still at like 1040. So not too much fermentation to happen. Maybe it was 1030, something like that. And I could taste it prominently. I let it go till the end of the week, about 7 days or so of fermentation, and let the krausen drop and everything. Taste it again. Not a speck of diacetyl. This will also come into play with lagers. Lagers will frequently have diacetyl, and because most people will ferment lagers at a lower temperature, down in the 50s, 60s, sometimes even down in the 40s, the yeast doesn't get active enough to eat up that diacetyl. So there's a lot of literature out there that says that lagers should be risen close to the tail end of fermentation to about 70 degrees as a diacetyl rest to get the yeast to consume that diacetyl. Also for lagers, and anytime you're concerned, there is what's called a VDK test. That's a vicinal diketones test. I'm going to link to one of those test sheets in the description so you can see how to do it. But it's basically a way to test to see if you have diacetyl in the beer. And because if you know about it, you can deal with it. You can warm up the beer, you get the yeast to be a little bit more active and clean up that diacetyl. There are some styles that allow this in low levels. British bitters allow it particularly, and Scottish ales don't specifically allow it, but they do allow for a low-level butterscotch aroma. So that's really close to diacetyl, more of like a caramely diacetyl. Oh, and another source of diacetyl, which you likely won't see in a homebrew competition situation, is dirty tap lines. If you ever go to a restaurant and you taste like a major brewery's, whatever, like a Sam Adams, let's say, like a Sam Adams Boston Lager is a perfect example because I think I've done this with their beer. If not, there was one that I tried at a restaurant and got a butter flavor. I can almost assure you that Sam Adams does not put out any beer with diacetyl in it. They know their shit. So this was likely a dirty tap line situation. Next one is sour. Now sour is one that you'll see sometimes checked. And by sometimes, if you put in a sour beer, you'll frequently see that checked. I think I went through 6 or 8 score sheets that I've done with sour beers, and all but like 2 or 3 of them, sour was checked. So sometimes it's okay because those were sour beers. It was a Flanders Red, and one of them was a Flanders Red, one of them was a Goza. But if a beer is sour that shouldn't be sour, yes, it should be checked, and it's an off flavor. Usually it's a result of lack of attention to cleaning and sanitization. And of course, you have to clean and sanitize. Both those things are important because you can't sanitize shit. If it's unintended sourness, you can have like a clean lactic sourness. Usually that's an infection from equipment. Or you can have more vinegary. It's an acetic sourness. That's usually, vinegar is from acetic acid, which starts from Acetobacter, frequently carried by fruit flies. So just think about that part a second. And then also it needs more oxygen. It's an aerobic bacteria. So that's bad news in any situation where it's not a sour beer. DMS, or dimethyl sulfate, that is a sweet, corny flavor. Now that's not always an off flavor In the cases of things like American lagers and cream ales, it's okay because that style allows for corn to be used in the brewing, which you'll get the DMS from. However, you can get it from light colored malt. It's not as common nowadays because of advances in malting technology, but if you don't boil hard enough or long enough with a lot of Pilsner, really light malt, you can get that. Also, if the boil is covered, you can get DMS or anything that causes the boil vapors to drip back into the boil kettle. And there's a claim that actually happens with Rolling Rock. I don't know for sure, but there's stories out there of Rolling Rock got bought out and they fixed the brewing process. In other words, they got the DMS to stop dripping into the kettle, or the boil vapors to stop dripping into the kettle, causing DMS. And people got pissed off because it tasted differently. I've also seen another source that claims that you can smell it in canned black olives. It's been a long time since I've smelled canned black olives, and I'm not a huge fan of olives in general, so I'll leave that up to you. So, next one is vegetal. So think of like a rotten or a leafy flavor, like it's been fall, like November in Cincinnati, possibly earlier as you go north or later as you go south, or maybe non-existent as you go south, depending on how far you go. And invert those if you're in the southern hemisphere, by the way. But think like a nasty kind of vegetal, leafy, rotten kind of flavor. That usually means old and stale ingredients, and it's in all flavor in all situations. Fresh hops that have been poorly used or used too long sometimes can cause that. Old malt extract will do that. Poor yeast health and management can cause that too. So, and vegetal is such a large span of what can pass as vegetal, that it's okay to just to put down on a score sheet. Yeah, check your yeast health, check your ingredients, because always use fresh ingredients. Astringency, that's a harsh bitterness. They call it a mouth puckering dryness, like sucking on a tea bag, which I can say I've never actually done. You can have that from a variety of sources. Too hot of a sparge will do that because it pulls that astringency out of the grain. Too high of a mash pH will also do that. Dark grains will cause astringency, particularly if you use them for the full mash as opposed to just sparging through the dark grains to get the color. Overhopping, particularly with fresh or old hops, can cause that. You can get this from like a low-level oxidization too. Sometimes you'll get a low-level oxidization that causes a harsher bitterness that makes it taste astringent. So sometimes this is okay. If you have dark grain derived astringency in, say, an American stout, it's okay to have at a low level. Again, if it interferes with your enjoyment of the beer, it's bad. So phenolics. This is another one that can go either way, because it can be a nice spiciness from a yeast, particularly in Belgian styles, like a saison. Sometimes you get like a spiciness, or some doubles, triples, particularly triples. I've had it, where you get like kind of like a nice spiciness from the yeast, and that's fine. But if it's not supposed to be there, or if it's smoky or medicinal or plastic or burnt, you don't want that, and that's a yeast health issue, and it's a yeast derived flavor. So if you have yeast that's stressed, it can throw phenolics. Solventy is another yeast issue, but slightly different. So that's like a flavor like a nail polish remover, or acetone, or paint thinner, or jet fuel. In fact, it is headache causing, because the fusel alcohols can cause a headache if you drink too much of them. I've actually had beers of that from under-oxidized or too hot of fermentations. It's yeast that's being stressed. Now, that shouldn't be confused with boozy alcoholic. If it's hot from alcohol and it's just the alcohol taste because you have a higher alcohol beer, like an imperial stout, let's say, that's okay. It can come from use of sugar, beer that needs to be aged more. A young imperial stout, you'll get this sometimes. And I've had it in imperial stouts. I've never marked it as being I mean, I've marked it down as it's there, but I've never really dinged anyone for it because I've never had it at such a level that it should be. Although I do have an untapped review out there somewhere where I basically said something like, boozy, something else boozy, something else boozy, something else. Oh, and did I mention this is boozy? Because it was a beer that was particularly boozy. So estery is another yeast issue, but it's not always a bad issue. In some cases, like English and Belgian ales, you can get a fruitiness from the yeast that's allowed in the style. But you shouldn't have it in all cases. A nice clean German Pilsner should not be fruity. It shouldn't. It's not part of the style guideline. And in cases like that, make sure you're pitching enough healthy yeast. Grassy. Grassy is, think of fresh cut grass, moist fresh cut grass. Not like the middle of the summer when half the lawn's brown, but spring or fall when the lawn's green. And that's usually from hops. You can get it from excessive dry hopping, particularly with fresh or whole hops. This is not one I've ever personally noticed in a beer, although I did have it marked on a score sheet once. I didn't notice it in the beer, but it was probably 6 or 7 years ago. And that was actually whole hops that I used, fresh whole hops. So if you use whole hops, don't dry hop them too long. Most people really use the T90 pellets, so that's not really an issue. Right. So light struck or skunked beer. You know this when you smell it, trust me. And that's literally a skunky flavor. If you don't know what that smells like, you're lucky. That's an interaction of ultraviolet with hop cohumulones. You can get this by allowing beer to get into too much contact with ultraviolet light sources. Sunlight, really bad. Fluorescent light, not great. In fact, when I ferment beers, I cover them. I actually keep towels over them to keep that light out to make sure I don't have skunky beer. Also, no clear bottles, no green bottles. Those are bad. And if you want to try this, we actually had a time with the Cincinnati Malt Infusers where somebody was doing a presentation on English brown ales, and they brought in a 6-pack of Newcastle Brown, which is one of the standard beers. It's listed in the BJCP guidelines as one of the commercial standards. And we opened these up and we're taking little pours of them and passing it around. I poured one out, handed it to the guy next to me, took a whiff. Total skunk. In fact, I even looked at him. I just had that, skunked look. And even the presenter was like, "Oh yeah, and if you guys want to know what skunked beer tastes and smells like, take a whiff." There's one exception to the clear bottle rule, and that's Miller Genuine Draft. They use a hop extract that has that cohumulone removed from it, so it does not skunk even in the clear beers. Now, mind you, it's also a low hop beer, so they may just not have enough hops to, react with. But yeah, removing that cohumulone really helps. I'm sorry, not a cohumulone, isohumulone. So, metallic flavors. Metallic flavors are frequently from mineral content or unpassivated stainless. The fix for that is to check water sources. I'll be honest, I have never had a metallic tasting beer. Never. Out of thousands of commercial and homebrew beers, I've never had one that tasted metallic. Musty. Musty is an oxidized flavor, which I don't think is common. I have had one beer that was musty, and it was one that we had difficulty figuring out. I knew the beer had a problem. I brought it into the homebrew club and had some of the actual BJCP judges taste it. They couldn't figure out what the hell was going on. I later found out there was mold in a bottling bucket that I was using to hold water. If you go back to some of my previous videos, I've talked about my water has a lot of chlorine in it. And they've cut back a little bit. It used to be so bad, I would turn on the water in the morning to brush my teeth and it would smell like a swimming pool. So I set out my water the night before I brewed to get that chlorine to come out. And if I forget, I do have Campton tablets too. And I was doing like a major double brew day, and I actually brewed 15 gallons in one weekend. And I needed my bottling bucket to do that, to hold water, and later found out that, it was bad. That was unfortunately a dumper. So, sulfuric. So that's an infection usually. High sulfates in water can do that. Using too many sulfates to stabilize a beer. There's a commercial beer that somebody brought into a club meeting that we all got that sulfur from, and it was one that the brewer had used sulfates in it, and we kind of wondered, well, maybe they used too much. Some lager yeast will also produce sulfur, and that usually, if you leave them to ferment out, they will burn off or eat or whatever to that sulfur. I can admit I've smelled it in lager fermentations, but I've never actually tasted it in a lager beer, that I've fermented. So I always make sure my beers ferment out, particularly lagers. So yeah, let it ferment longer, depending on the yeast. So these next two are not on the BJCP guidelines. I went to an all-flavor training course that was really more geared towards cicerones, and they had two that weren't mentioned. One of them was earthy, which they say is generally from contamination, although I've had earthy flavors from beers that included coffee or mosaic hops in some cases. And then the other one that they mentioned was leathery, which they say develops during the aging after the appearance of rancid oils and papery notes. So I've had beers that had kind of a leatheriness to them, but it was a pleasant leatheriness. Not the same. And those two I've never had in a homebrewed beer. I take that back. I've had earthy in homebrewed beers, but it's not as common. And like I said, if a beer has coffee in it, sometimes you can get that earthiness from the coffee. If it has mosaic in it, I've had beers that were all mosaic that had like an earthiness to them, and I think that's one of the flavor profiles depending on how you use mosaic hops. So that's the end of the list. Again, in the notes, I've got the BJCP fault list in the notes, as well as the VDK test that you can do. Particularly if you're doing lagers, it's definitely a good thing to do to make sure that you don't have any diacetyl ultimately in your beer. And with that, subscribe, video, cheers.